The webinar will begin shortly. We're just waiting for a couple more people to connect their audio. Hello, and welcome to Climate Bonds Initiative's 2016 webinar series. Today, we'll be exploring the road aspects of the Climate Bonds low-carbon transport criteria with Anna Creed, Head of Standards here at Climate Bonds, and Pier Paolo Cazzola from the International Energy Agency. But first, a couple of housekeeping notes. To keep up to date with our work at Climate Bonds and for announcements of future webinars in this series, you can register for our blog at climatebonds.net. If you have any questions as we go through the presentation, please use the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. I'll collate them and put them to Anna and Pier Paolo at the end. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and sent by email to all those who have registered. Now, over to Anna.
Great, thanks, Johnny. On the call today, I'm going to be talking a bit about the Climate Bonds Initiative and giving an overview of the green bond market. And then moving on to green bond labelling and the role of standards within that. And then talking more specifically about the climate bond standard and the certification scheme. And then we'll move on to talk about the transport criteria in more depth, focusing on the road-based assets. As Johnny said, we have a broader set of criteria for land-based transport. We previously covered rail-related assets on a previous webinar. That's now available on our website if you're interested in the rail-based assets. I would encourage you to listen to that webinar as well. And then I will pass it over to Pier Paolo, who will give us his expert insights from his perspective of the IEA and his engagement with the technical working group of the Climate Bonds Initiative. And then I'll hand over for the Q&A as well. So the first step, the Climate Bonds Initiative and what we do. We were created by investors in a move to give clarity and structure around climate bonds and green bonds. And we have 4 key areas of work. The first one is the Climate Bond Standard and Certification Scheme. This gives definitions for investors and guidelines for bond issuers. And those definitions and guidelines are developed through multi-stakeholder engagement, and we convene a lot of technical and industry working groups to input their expertise into the development of the standard itself. And it's hoped that through this process, we can build investor confidence using assurance and certification as a means to give transparency and confidence in the markets. The second key area of our work is around information flows for rating agencies and index providers. A key part of growing the green bond market and the climate bond market is having robust and extensive data. And we do a lot of work monitoring green bonds that are being released and climate-aligned bonds that are being released globally. And the icon on this page is for our State of the Market report. We produce this annually, giving a snapshot of green bond issuances and climate-aligned issuances over the past year and outstanding. We also have a lot of variations for different geographies as well. So please see our website if you're interested in reading those reports. The third area of our work is outreach to inform and stimulate the market. So we do a lot of work relating to policy models, government advice, working with regulators in different jurisdictions, and we're really making efforts, particularly in emerging markets, to grow issuance. And that includes work that we do in China, India, and Brazil, amongst other countries. And we are starting to get good penetration in terms of alignment with domestic regulations and issues in those markets. And lastly, our fourth area of work is our Partners Programme, which is a platform for market participants to get involved in the formative stages of the development and use of the standard. And it's a tailored way to support CBI's efforts to accelerate growth in green bond issuance and demand. And it's really for those who want to get deeper into this space of green and climate bonds. So just a quick recap then of what are green bonds. And if this is for those who are new to the field, just a couple of minutes on green bonds themselves. Essentially, a bond is simply a form of debt. They're used to finance large and mature assets. They're issued generally by large entities, such as companies, governments, municipalities, banks, and often those entities actually buy each other's bonds. And we do see a really large variety in the bond market in that space. Bonds are an important part of investment portfolios for investors such as pension funds, insurance companies, institutional investors, etc. They're often seen as a defensive investment. It's often said that you go to the equity markets to make money, but you might go to the bond market to keep it. They generally are more secure, and as a consequence, they have lower returns than equity investments as a very general rule. That's bonds in general. A green bond specifically is a bond where the proceeds are used to finance environmentally friendly assets. This obviously has an impact on who wants to buy them, and we hope if they're successful will also have a positive impact in the world in terms of the nature of the future structures and infrastructure that we're building that is climate compatible and will really help to bring us onto a 2-degree or 1.5-degree trajectory. There's a massive challenge and opportunity, obviously, in this respect. It's estimated that we need 50 to 90 trillion to finance the low carbon transition over the next 5 years. And it's really hoped that bonds can play a really important role, given that they are used to finance many trillions worth of infrastructure and other investments at the moment. From a climate point of view, it's about mitigation and adaptation and resilience. But in the investor community, it's often about asset classes. And today we're going to be talking about transport and specifically road-related assets. But there are other key sectors in this space. And obviously renewable energy is a key part of that. So examples here include solar, wind, bioenergy, geothermal, hydro, for example. There's a lot of work to do in terms of transition to low-carbon buildings and industrial facilities. And sustainable water management. There's a lot of investment to do in water infrastructure, storm adaptation. Waste management is another key sector. And land use, which covers agriculture, forestry, food supply chains, anything related to primary land use. And also on here, we haven't got an icon, but ICT and broadband. And that will be a very interesting sector to think about actually how ICT, which is very information, communication and technology, can really contribute to reducing emissions and making us more adaptable and resilient to coming climate change. And really our vision for 2050 is that we have solved climate change. So the question that we're asking with all of these sectors and asset classes is what assets and investments do we need to make now to achieve the 2-degree or ideally 1.5-degree target for the medium term? Green bonds is very much a growth market. This chart is based on data in the latest State of the Market report, and you can see that there's been a real growth surge over the last few years. The first green bonds were issued in around about 2007 by the EIB and the World Bank, so the European Investment Bank and the World Bank. And we see up until about 2014, so these early years up until 2013, that was very much dominated by development banks. 2014, we really started to see corporates enter this space, which is the crimson part of the bar chart. In 2016, we are hoping to see, again, steady growth from 2015's numbers. We estimate, based on People's Bank of China numbers, that a big segment of this might come from China, maybe as much as 46 billion in green bond issued from China, with a total 2016 expectation of $100 billion worth of green bonds. And I should say our target really, in terms of what we're aiming to achieve, is a $1 trillion a year green bond market. So early days, strong growth, but we still have a way to go. So let's look forward to that. In terms of the range of assets that are being financed through green bonds or climate bonds, renewables is a key part of that. Clean energy is definitely the most developed segment. But there are many other pieces to this pie. Energy efficiency, low carbon buildings is a significant element at the moment, and also low carbon transport. Water and water infrastructure is an important area, and we see a lot of issuances from municipalities and public entities, as well as private organisations in the water space. And we are seeing other sectors grow and emerge. So agriculture and forestry is one of those developing sectors that we would really like to see grow quite rapidly. Obviously, there's a lot of potential there, not just for reduced emissions, but also increased sequestration and carbon capture and storage through land use. So that is going to be an important sector if we are going to crack climate change. So we'd really love to see strong growth in that sector. And in terms of the attraction of green bonds, we're often asked not just what is a green bond, but why is it of value to investors, especially when it can cost to deliver a green bond as opposed to a regular bond. This slide just tried to capture some of those arguments about the value of a green bond. From an issuer's point of view, and the issuer is effectively the borrower, they're the ones issuing the bond and selling it to investors out in the marketplace. So the advantages to them are it can bring in diversification of investors, those who are interested in green investments and green bonds that maybe haven't bought bonds from that issuer before. So there can be good diversification. And generally, people who buy green bonds tend to hold on to them a bit longer. We say they're stickier than investments in regular bonds. And at the moment, there is definitely excess demand over supply, and we see strong oversubscription for green bonds, and therefore a slight tightening of the yield on those. Generally, and these are benefits that accrue to both the issuer and the investor, issuing or investing in green bonds can really strengthen the reputation of involved parties to show that your company, your brand, your local government organisation, whoever it is, really are committed to a climate-compatible green future. And that can be quite an important part of the messaging for a lot of corporates and other sorts of entities. It can also help to build sort of long-term relationships between issuers and investors, because of this point that people do like to rebuy and hold on to green bonds. So it can lead to good, strong relationship between issuers and investors than perhaps you see with regular bonds. And looking at it more precisely from the investor's side, it's always true to say that well-understood projects reduce risk exposure, and well-managed projects can reduce risk exposure. I mean, I guess the basic message here is what's measured is managed. And with a green bond, the emphasis is a lot on how the money is going to be spent, what are the green use of proceeds, which does enable a greater degree of disclosure and transparency over the use of proceeds, the use of the investment financing and the impact of that. And that is always good news for an investor, that they have greater visibility over that. Okay, in terms of green bond labelling, if issuers are claiming benefits from green aspects of the bonds, there's a real need to protect investors from greenwashing. In the early days, when it was development banks that were issuing green bonds, those entities have strong expertise and processes. But as corporates entered the market more and more around about 2014, more questions were raised about actually how green is this, what impact is it going to have? Is this real, or is it just greenwashing? So there is a need for a system of environmental due diligence that can review key environmental attributes and it would complement existing financial due diligence. There are a lot of assets in this space, and there's a lot of uncertainty about climate change risks and opportunities. Investors can't always evaluate very effectively those uncertainties and risks and the solutions that are being proposed to them. Sometimes specialist expertise is required regarding what counts as green, and also there are economies of scale by having this done by people who have that scientific and technical expertise, so that each individual investor doesn't need to go and assess that for themselves. Even if it were feasible for them, it would be very costly to assess and verify on a case-by-case basis for every potential issuer. So with that in mind, I think we've identified 3 principles for a good system of environmental due diligence: that it's scientifically robust, it will actually deliver us on a path to 1.5 degrees, and it will enable us to be adaptable and resilient to climate change. Also that it's transparent, that people know what they're investing in, they know what's being claimed in respect of its greenness, and what it will actually deliver over time. And also that there is consistency, so that investors, when they're looking around the marketplace, they're not having to deal with people who are defining green in different ways, which actually won't help them too much if we're all working on different definitions of what green is. There are 3 key dimensions to green bond labelling. The first is reach, and this is really the question of what sort of programme approach are we taking. Are we talking about voluntary or mandatory participation? And connected with that, are we talking about recommended guidelines or principles, or fixed standards and requirements? The second dimension is scope, and this is really about the sort of multiple parts of this. Some are more common, and it's about the process of management of funds and reporting requirements. And then this tricky question of what actually counts as green, and what we can identify as green assets. And in this space, you often people talking about a green taxonomy or green definitions or green eligibility criteria. And then the third key dimension is the assurance process. So investors want confidence and low risk of greenwashing, and there's various ways that the assurance process can be set up with varying degrees of security. The lowest level of security is down here as first-party assessment, and it's where the bond issuer basically self-declares the bond is green according to their own definitions of green, and doesn't have any independent oversight or audit or verification done on that. The second layer is a second-party assessment. So in that instance, the bond issuer, possibly in conjunction with a second opinion provider, will define what green is and what works for them as a company and where their vision is. And then they will have an independent party come in and assess their bond against those standards of green that they have set themselves. And then the last level is third-party verification. So this is where there is evaluation against a set of external, common, transparent criteria, not set by the bond issuer, but set externally. And somebody comes in, again, externally and does an independent verification and assessment against that standard or set of criteria. And if we look at how green bond labelling has evolved over time, I've mentioned already that the first issuers were the multilateral banks back in 2007, and they were generally self-labelling and self-reporting, or using second opinions. And this is credible and robust because of the nature of those institutions, the knowledge, expertise and resource base that they have. However, there was a bit of a turning point in 2014 when corporates entered the market in larger numbers. They utilised the emerging green bond principles and second opinion market. The green bond principles have been drawn up by the ICMA, so it's a financial community group that have developed voluntary guidelines for those who wish to participate in the green bond market in an effort to really increase understanding and a common baseline about what's required to issue a green bond. The climate bond standard takes that a step further, so it really takes the green bond principles and really enhances it to really develop out a definition of what would be green across all of the different sectors of a low-carbon economy and put measurable metrics and thresholds and specific requirements against those. And we work with scientists and technical experts to do that. And through this, we can define a climate-compatible taxonomy of eligible investments and eligibility criteria. And we require independent verification before a bond can be certified. And more recently, we see countries in many jurisdictions developing national green bond regulations. And one obvious and important example of that is the Chinese authorities, who are doing a lot of work around the green bond catalogue and the regulations for issuing green bonds and defining green bonds. Looking forward, we do see strong demand. Currently, there is excess demand for green bonds, and we see oversubscription. And we really believe that investor demand will continue to be strong and increase in line with the delivery of credible quality products into the market. And standards, assurance and certification are going to be key elements to that, because as I said previously, it's those things that will make it easier for mainstream investors to get on board with confidence. And for issuers too, so they can be sure they're doing the right thing. They're not doing something which somebody is telling them is green, and then over time it will turn out not to be green, which would destroy their confidence in wanting to come to the market with a green bond. That's also important from the issuer side. Critical to success will be harmonisation of cross-territory standards with national regulations. There will likely always be a variety of standards, but really we would like to see that they are based on common frameworks, common principles. Yes, they might be adapted to national circumstances, but the core underlying fundamentals are consistent across all of those systems and standards. And to ensure that that happens, governments have a key role to play in developing and rolling out these standards and encouraging market development, as well as those of us like CBI who kind of facilitate in between all those governments and industry bodies working in this space. Moving on to the Climate Bond Standard and Certification Scheme. I mentioned this briefly, but essentially the Climate Bond Standard is designed to be a robust and effective certification scheme, providing clear requirements for issuers. It defines clear, objective, sector-specific climate eligibility criteria for projects and assets. And it also provides clear mandatory requirements regarding the use of proceeds, tracking and reporting, and including assurance framework with independent verifiers. And then it requires certification by an independent climate bond standard board, which is made up of investors and international NGOs with 36 trillion of assets under management. It is probably useful to re-emphasize that if you're using the climate bond standard, if your bond is certified under the climate bond standard, you can be confident that it's fully aligned with the green bond principles. And a wide variety of bond types are eligible for certification. We define that in our parent standard, so if anybody's interested in that, I'd encourage you to look there. It's important to note, though, and to remember that the Climate Bond Standard is an environmental standard, not a financial standard. So investors must continue to do their own credit analysis on the bonds. And just briefly, I just wanted to talk through the process for certification, which very much aligns with the normal phases of the bond market. There's two steps. The first one is pre-issuance certification. So the issuer prepares to issue the bond. As part of that process, they prepare also for certification. They might create a green bond framework. They will provide their basic information and the information form to the Climate Bonds Initiative. Critically, they are required to appoint an independent verifier who will undertake a readiness assessment of the use of proceeds for the bond. And then the issuer submits their information form and the verifier report to CBI, and the Standards Board can confirm or not pre-issuance certification. And if that is confirmed and pre-issuance certification is given, the issuer can then use the Climate Bond Standard mark in its marketing and communications and for its roadshow. And then post-issuance, the verifier comes back It undertakes a review of how the money has actually been used or allocated, and it prepares another report on that basis, and that is submitted to us again, and it is put in front of the Standards Board, who should confirm climate bond certification based on that information. Certification is then valid for the term of the bond, but we can revoke it if it is determined that over time what was promised with the bond is not actually being delivered, if investments are changing or if impacts are not being received in that way. Although I have to stress this has not happened yet. We have not had to revoke any certifications, but we do have the ability to do so should that be needed. And in that process, we're very much guided by the ISAE 3000. That's the standard we invoke for steps of this certification process. This next slide just outlines the climate bonds taxonomy. So we are working in all of these areas to develop sector-specific criteria for what actually counts as green. And so this covers the asset groups that we spoke about previously. So there's a lot around renewable energy, around low-carbon buildings, industry and energy-intensive commercial buildings, waste management and pollution, low-carbon transport, information technology and communication. There's a lot around nature-based assets on the land and in the marine space, and also water infrastructure. This library, the ticks in the blue circles indicate where we already have criteria, and the yellow circles indicate where we currently have technical working groups convening to develop criteria for those subsectors. And we are working hard with those technical working groups and their associated industry working groups and other stakeholders to really roll out and develop this full library as quickly as possible. In terms of participants in the certification process, we've seen a fantastic range of issues to date, including banks, financing groups, public entities, and importantly across a whole range of countries, which is really exciting that we're really seeing green bonds and certified climate bonds take off around the world. We also have here an ever-growing number of approved verifiers. CBI does vet and approve verifiers before they can be used by issuers to verify the use of proceeds for their bonds. So we do monitor that situation, and we have an ever-growing list there. And I think investors appreciate that this is a peer group of theirs, and it really helps to build trust in the system. And now moving on more specifically to the transport criteria themselves. Just a little bit of background on transport's role. There is a real need for investment in transport. It's currently the second largest contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions after electricity generation, estimated to be responsible for nearly a quarter of all energy-related carbon dioxide emissions globally, and 14% of total greenhouse gas emissions. According to the IEA, around about 16 trillion in additional transport investment will be required over the coming decades to achieve the rapid decarbonisation needed in this sector. And it's very certainly true that current investment flows are not flowing at the scale needed. We really need to scale up and shift investment towards low carbon transport infrastructure. And refinancing of existing transport assets through bonds is a key opportunity in the near term. And on top of that, as we roll out new programs of new infrastructure, new transport infrastructure, there's a potential for green bonds to really be active in that space for new infrastructure and for upgrades of existing transport infrastructure. Bonds are already used a lot for low-carbon transport. It's a very common financing tool for transport infrastructure, and there's a really long legacy on this. Looking more specifically at climate-aligned transport bonds in 2016, we do see that that's very much dominated by rail, but there are other elements in there, so bus, transit, energy-efficient vehicles, etc. And often municipalities and public entities are really key in this space. They put a lot of public assets, and we do see a lot of municipalities issuing transport-related bonds, often in large programs of investments that they're kind of stacking or phasing over time to match their pipeline of infrastructure upgrades and infrastructure rollouts. This next slide just has a snapshot of green bond examples more specifically for road-based assets. These are all pretty recent, actually. So Transport for London was in April 2015. All of the others have been in 2016, and they're very much focusing on electric and hybrid vehicles. So that is a key part of the plans for road-based assets. So when we look at the climate bond standard and eligibility criteria for road-related assets, we face the question of which transport assets are low carbon. And our primary objective at CBI is to ensure that any land transport projects or assets that we certify would contribute to meeting an emissions trajectory consistent with limiting global temperature rises to 2 degrees Celsius. And the approach that was taken by the technical working group was to set universal thresholds for emissions per passenger transport in terms of per passenger kilometre, and for freight transport in terms of per tonne per kilometre, that would apply to all land transport modes. And importantly, those thresholds decreasing over time to keep us on the path to this 2-degree future. Pier Paolo will talk more in his presentation about the basis for the selection of these universal thresholds. So I will leave that with him. But I think it's important to stress why we have gone for universal thresholds here. One, being that they're simple to understand. Two, that they're technology agnostic, and therefore they contribute to an even playing field, and they really build us for the future within the space of the carbon budgets that we need to be working within. This is the basic principles, or the universal threshold is the basic principle. We have also done some work to see which assets and projects will qualify automatically to meet this. And we are increasingly adopting at CBI what we're calling a traffic light system to make it easier to interpret the criteria. In essence, anything that is highlighted in green, the text is green on here, is automatically eligible because it would automatically meet those universal thresholds. Anything in orange is subject to a test that it would meet the universal threshold. So just very quickly, so the assets and projects here relating to road-based transports, we would include for consideration for certification public passenger transport, which would include trams and buses. And electrified public transport would automatically qualify. For non-electrified infrastructure, we need to be, the verifier's report needs to show that the per kilometre emissions are below the appropriate threshold for the time frame of the bond. And as regards private light duty and heavy goods vehicles, very similar. So full electric vehicles will automatically qualify. Hybrid vehicles will qualify if they meet the universal thresholds, if they're below the universal thresholds. So that is our key qualifying restriction there. And supporting infrastructure I'll talk about a bit on the next slide, but I think it's probably important to note that we don't currently certify bonds where parts of the proceeds are being used to build the roads themselves. So we are very much focusing on the electric and hybrid vehicles that can be below the emission threshold. Just moving on to this supporting infrastructure. Basically, we are including, in relation to roads, although we're not doing the roads themselves, what would be automatically eligible is dedicated charging on alternative fuel infrastructure, so long as it's separate from fossil fuel filling stations and garages. So this is things like electric charging points, for example. We also automatically would certify retrofits for public transport infrastructure, public walking and cycling infrastructure, and cycling schemes. What will be eligible on a case-by-case basis, depending on the impacts that could be associated with those projects and assets, would be ICT that improves asset utilisation, flow and modal shift, also intermodal freight facilities, investment in terminals to improve journey times, and smart freight logistics. So there's a lot of work that can be done around the transport space to really enhance and maximise maximize the impacts of low carbon transport. And really this is what this section is trying to capture. It's very difficult to set consistent criteria for that just because of the range of investments and assets that you could see in this space. But we are open to the flexibility here to be able to recognize innovation and essential elements of building that low carbon infrastructure for road assets. Okay, and now I'm going to hand back to Johnny.
Thanks, Anna. We're now going to hear from the International Energy Agency's Pier Paolo Cazzola, who is going to give an overview of the IEA energy technology perspectives and their interplay with the low carbon transport criteria. Pier Paolo coordinates the work of the Transport Unit of the IEA Energy Technology Policy Division in the Directorate of Sustainability, Technology and Outlooks, and that includes the development of the IEA mobility model. Previously, Pier Paolo worked at the United Nations, the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, the Environment Director of the OECD, and the Energy Statistics Division of the IEA. Amongst all that, Pier Paolo also contributed to the technical working group who developed the criteria we are looking at today. Are you there, Pier Paolo?
Yes. Yes.
I'm just going to make you presenter.
Right. Yeah. Do you see the presentation on the screen?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. And yes, as was just mentioned, the idea for me is to try to provide you a little bit of insight on the logic that was applied to actually develop the threshold that I use for the low carbon land transport criteria. The title of the presentation is Insights from the IEA Energy Technology Perspectives Analysis, because there's a lot of weight in how the energy technology perspective analysis actually influence the quantitative targets. First, let me give you some explanation of what this energy technology perspectives is. So this is a series of publications that is focusing primarily on low carbon technologies and low carbon scenarios that started to be published in 2006 and initially was published every 2 years, and since 2014 became an annual publication of the agency. The focus, as I said, is in a low carbon scenario, which is called 2DS, which is an acronym for 2 degree scenario. So the 2DS scenario is compatible with a 50% chance to limit the global temperature increase to 2 degrees, and is also aligned with the possibility to actually move the economic system towards a more sustainable, in a more sustainable direction. For instance, in the case of transport, solutions are not just compatible with the 2DS pathway, but also with the possibility to reduce the emissions of local pollutants or alleviate congestion. So there are also other aspects of sustainability which are addressed by the scenarios. The 2 other scenarios are called 4DS and 6DS. The 4DS is a scenario that looks at current strategies and recent pledges for energy efficiency. And the 6DS is a conservative scenario taking into account, let's say, the BAUs, not the BAU, sorry, it's the benchmark scenario. If you want to summarize, the BAU is closer to the 6DS, the 4DS, the 6DS is our benchmark, and the 2DS is our low carbon scenario. The 2016 edition of ETP, which is actually follows the work we did for the climate bond standards, but ends up having very similar results, focuses specifically on urban energy systems, and provides insights on policy recommendations, looking especially at the local dimension of the policies. This is new in the framework of ETPs, because until 2016 we weren't capable to actually look separately at the urban aspects compared to the rest of the economy. As far as transport is concerned, this means that we acquired the ability to say something on the evolution of activity, energy demand, and greenhouse gas emissions taking place in urban areas, and to project this, understand how urbanization rates, for instance, influence transport-related parameters, and also how the urban or non-urban environment interplay with the deployment of energy-efficient technologies and energy-efficient modal allocations. Typically, here you have graphics that show greenhouse gas emissions in the 6DS and 2DS scenarios from 2013 to 2050, which on the left are characterized with respect to the savings and which kind of energy, so which kind of primary energy is coupled with which type of savings. On the right, you have the same type of boundaries, upper and lower. The upper boundary is the 6DS scenario, the lower boundary is the 2DS scenario, where you have the contribution of the different sectors. So transport accounts for about 18% of the total emission savings between 6DS and 2DS. And actually, this is achieved in the case of transport with a combination of different measures, which I'm going to detail a little bit further later on. Before moving on, I just wanted to point out that the main savings actually take place in the power generation sector. You see it with the lower wedge on the right side, while industry and transport contribute to a similar magnitude, and there's a lower contribution from buildings in terms of energy, in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions. Here you have an idea of how we actually get our data. So the transport model that we use for ETP is primarily building on socioeconomic projections on economic growth and population growth, as well as urbanization. We're basically combining these with assumptions on the evolution of energy prices and considerations that represent in the model the policy environment where the evolution of the economies, the population, and the energy prices will take place. So that means, for instance, that we track down different kinds of fuel taxation regimes or different kinds of regulatory developments. And then we convert how these impact on the choice of different technologies or the contribution of different technologies, and also on the evolution of the activity. So ultimately the policy scenario, so for instance the 2DS scenario, is the result of then understanding where the economies are bound to go and how policies can change the direction of emissions with respect to a situation where there's an absence of policy change. Here you have some kind of high-level results. There are some key regions of the world for which we have projections in the 6DS. This is projections expressed in terms of energy demand. To some extent, this also reflects differences, projections in terms of activity, except that the activities are not filtered through changes in the energy intensity. Anyway, this shows in purple a 6DS scenario, in yellow the 4DS, and then with a set of different colors and the residual energy demand of the 2DS scenario. What is important to notice here is that there are absolute reductions actually in energy demand expected even in the 6DS and the 4DS in the OECD countries, while there are absolute increases in major developing economies, with a possibility for a stabilization towards the end of the projection period, which is 2050. There are some developing regions which are currently those with the lowest level of income per capita, where energy demand is expected to continue to increase throughout the projection period in all the scenarios. So this gives you an idea about the fact that we have the capacity to actually characterize projections on a region-by-region basis by looking at primarily, I would say, the G20 countries plus aggregates for the complementary part of the world. And then this is what leads us to be able to identify which kind of measures and to which extent they contribute to the reduction of emissions between the 6DS, the 4DS, and the 2DS scenarios. The three key instruments that we consider while looking at this emission mitigation are avoided emissions and shifted emissions. For instance, from densification of urban areas, you have a lower distances between origins and destination that result in a lower need to move, and therefore lower requirement in terms of energy demand and CO2 emissions. You also have, from densification policies and investment in public transportation, an increasing appeal for public transportation mode that can result in shifts toward more energy efficient and low carbon modes. You have a contribution that can be coming from energy technologies that are applied, for instance, to vehicles. That's the case for hybrid vehicles, plug-in electric or battery electric, for instance, which are all much significantly more efficient than conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. And then the last element is low carbon fuels. So there is a possibility to reduce the energy intensity of the fuels used. For instance, if you consider the production of advanced biofuels or electricity, low carbon electricity, once you have brought in a significant amount of electric cars, that ultimately result in a lower well-to-wheel emission boundary for the sector. There are differences, as I mentioned earlier, between the OECD and non-OECD, with a tendency to decline in all scenarios with respect to emissions in the OECD, and a tendency to increase in most of the scenarios in the non-OECD. That's driven by stronger economic growth prospects for non-OECD countries, strong population growth prospects as well, as opposed to a stabilization of population and I would say in most cases for OECD countries, the fact that we reached a sort of plateau with respect to the penetration of the most energy-intensive modes, and specifically passenger cars. So the 2DS scenario, once we were approached by climate bonds, we suggested to use actually the results that come out of the 2DS scenarios to generate these quantitative estimates of what could be a universal threshold. So we also, I would say, proposed actually the universal threshold to climate bonds, to the climate bond, for the climate bond standard, because we saw, as it was mentioned before, the universal threshold as a good solution to assure that systemic solutions that would be able to deliver would be considered on a level playing field and without picking winners a prioristically. We also decided to adopt different thresholds for emissions per passenger kilometers and per ton kilometers, because there is this fundamental difference between passenger and freight transportation. And again, the work that we have done for the ATP 2DS scenario helped, so enabled also the possibility to define these thresholds. And just to give you some taste about what these thresholds represent, so they're expressed in grams of CO2 per passenger kilometer or grams of CO2 per ton kilometer. Here I picked three numbers which are close to the reality where we are today, just to give you an idea of real-world examples. So first of all, there's the 87 in 2015. These corresponds, if you consider that a car emitting about 4.4 liter, consuming about 4.4 liter of gasoline equivalent per 100 kilometer, emits roughly 100 grams of CO2 per kilometer. The 87 means that the threshold for 2015 would be met by any kind of vehicle leading to emissions lower than somewhere close to 90 grams per kilometer. If you look at so that corresponds, that exceeds basically the limit that the Global Fuel Economy Initiative set for itself for 2030 and has to be read in a framework that shows that the current global average for cars and light trucks is close to 160 grams of CO2 per kilometer. So in some regions like Europe, we are close to 120 or below, but that's the case, for instance, only for Europe and Japan, which are the global leaders in terms of efficient cars. Looking more specifically at the single technologies, a Toyota Prius, the last model of the Toyota Prius in the European driving cycle emits 76 grams of CO2 per kilometer. So a Toyota Prius would qualify for the passenger climate bond standard only until 2020, and then would stop qualifying after that because the threshold actually gets tighter with time due to the fact that you have more technology penetration taking place over time in the ETP scenario. In the case of freight, I just tried to provide an example that gave you an idea of what this 27 in 2015 represents. And so I took as an example a truck, a heavy-duty truck that consumes about 30 liters per 100 kilometer. This converts to about 744 grams of CO2 per kilometer because it's diesel. And in this case, it means that qualifying for the standards require that an average load for this truck, which is close to 28 tons. Now, considering that trucks have a maximum capacity that is typically close to 40 tons, that means at least 70% load factor, which is fairly high, actually very high by global standard if you consider that in many cases there is a 40% share of empty running in the way trucks are currently utilized. So in order to make sure that these trucks could be qualifying for the climate bond standard, you would need to guarantee that the usage profile for this truck is optimized to allow much better performances than average with respect to the way the truck is loaded. So I hope this helps understanding a bit more of what is behind these numerical thresholds. I have no more slides, but I would be happy to take questions if people think, if people need more clarifications.
Thanks so much, Paolo. Just a reminder that you can ask a question using the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner. We've already had a couple. Let's start with, in light of the Paris Agreement, how does the picture change for a 1.5 degrees scenario? Is the IEA looking at this? Paolo, could you answer that?
Yes, I can. So the IEA is indeed looking at scenarios that would be compatible with meeting the requirement to reach the well below 2 degree target outlined in the Paris Agreement. There's quite a bit of debate on whether the well below means 1.8, 1.5, or so whether this should be expressed in terms of a different probability of meeting the 2 degree target. So I remind you the 2ds is coupled with a 50% chance to actually hit that target. We have had a workshop in June, and there are documents available on the IEA website if you look at the workshop page, where we kind of kick-started the work that should be materializing in different forms over the course of 2017, where the IEA will communicate on ways to try to achieve the well below 2 degree target outlined in the Paris Agreement. I am not in a position right now to provide more details, but there will be for sure outputs from the IEA in this direction.
Thank you. Next question, this one I think for Anna. The climate credentials of bioenergy has come under scrutiny, most recently in September's New Scientist, which is why we at Ethical Markets Media only count algae grown on salt water as eligible for our green transition scoreboard. What's the Climate Bond's view on bioenergy, and are you doing any work in this area?
Yeah, thank you. We are working on criteria for bioenergy at the moment, so they are in development with our technical working group. A bit like the approach that we've taken with transport, we are hoping to be, in the bioenergy space, feedstock agnostic. So really the screening criteria are really focusing around what is an acceptable level of emissions per unit of output. That could be applied across all feedstock types. So it will be through applying that emissions threshold that we would essentially be probably ruling out some types of feedstocks in some locations, but we are not predefining that up front. It would all be done through the application of the emissions threshold for bioenergy. But very much in development. We will be working on that for the next few months, and hope to have those criteria out for public consultation, draft criteria for public consultation, early in 2017.
Thank you, Anna. Just one last question then. How often will these criteria be reviewed to incorporate advances in transport technologies?
I'll answer that first, and then perhaps Paolo might have something to add on that one. But I think, again, because we're talking about a universal threshold that is declining over time to take us to a long-term target for 2050, it's being designed in this way so that we don't have to update it as the technology itself is improving and advancing, but more that we are working within carbon budgets, and that is already built into the forward-looking trajectory. Having said that, we will, as with all of our criteria, look to review them and revise them on a regular basis, as and when, I mean, for example, depending on how far on or off that trajectory we are as a global community, we might need to ratchet up or down those thresholds accordingly, and similarly, in respect of a 1.5 degree scenario versus a 2 degree scenario, again, we might need to ratchet them down. So yes, we will be looking to review them every 2 to 3 years. Paolo, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add on that question.
Just one comment that I think this depends on the cut you want to give to the well below 2 degree versus 2 degree debate. Clearly, the targets that exist right now are focused on this 2 degree target, maybe. But I do think that the Paris Agreement is an important milestone in the framework of the climate change debate. And by the way, today seems also to be quite an important day in that respect. Given the approval of the European Parliament of the Paris Agreement itself, and so the fact that it's actually going to enter into force. And so maybe that's, on that basis, there will be a need to think about revising the thresholds to look at lower, more ambitious climate targets, or hitting this well below, for instance. The total CO2 greenhouse gas emission budget that one can attach to the 2 degree, or for instance a 1.8 degree with both with a 50% chance to be reached, has quite significant impact with respect to the residual emissions that would need to be cut in transport and industry in particular by 2050. Because those are the sectors that have most of the residual emissions left. And so I would be happy if you want to go in further details on this debate, but I would say that the main revision that I expect would come from an eventual change in interpretation of what is a climate-friendly future, from the climate bond standards themselves, so whether they want to look at the 2 degree or below that.
Thank you very much, Pier Paolo. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for now. Just a reminder that this session was recorded. I'll email links out to all those who've registered in the next couple of days. To keep up to date with all things climate bonds, including future webinars and our market analysis, you can sign up to our blog on our website, climatebonds.net. We'd like to say a huge thank you to Pier Paolo Cazzola for joining us today and for his excellent presentation, and also to Anna Creed for hers. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good day.